Professor Dr. Ambassador Anil Suklaw, who's Deputy DG for Middle East and Asia at DIRCO, and my former boss, I have to add. Dr. Philani Mthembu, Executive Director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, colleagues and friends. I think from now on, we can simply say all protocols observed, as we would like to say, and then we cut out all the formalities after this. On behalf of the Executive Director of the Mthembu Institute, Mr. Joel Nechetenze, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar hosted by the Mthembu Institute, MISTRA. I want to begin with an apology, as a lot of people say we begin with apologies and so on, but this one is a really important apology that we have an all-male cast on the panel. There are no excuses for that, especially since MISTRA is overwhelmingly female in its staff composition, as are the vast number of researchers that are involved in our projects. I'm not even going to go into how this came to transpire, but rest assured, this is not normal practice. The theme of this webinar is COVID-19, Geopolitics, and the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the BRI. I have been arguing if anyone would listen to me, and Your Excellency, you know what it's like when you're no more an ambassador, no one wants to listen to you. But I've been insisting that the 2020s are going to be shaped by 3 C's. The 1 C is about climate talks, the other C is about COVID-19, and the 3rd C is about China. And those 3 C's are going to be really fundamental in how the world emerges during this decade. At today's seminar, we'll be addressing 2 of those C's, COVID-19 and China. And at the heart of the China element is the BRI. This webinar occurs at a really important week in the history of the world. It is almost 2 months since the inauguration of the Biden administration, which has promised to reset some of the most critical elements of US-China relations. Biden declared that China must expect extreme competition from the US, and in turn, President Xi Jinping has been insisting that we need to look at more cooperation between the US and China and the rest of the world. Recent developments indicate the direction taken by the Biden administration. You've had the quadrilateral security dialogue, which had been resurrected by former President Trump, meeting last week. And you wonder whether there will be many changes under the Biden administration. As people may know, and Dr. Mthembu in his paper refers to this quad, consists of the US, Australia, Japan, and India, and they met last week. At the same time, that is tomorrow, you've got the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan, that's Biden's national security advisor, would be meeting China's top foreign policy official, Yang Jiechi, and Wang Yi, its foreign minister. So these are really, really, really critical moments that we are going through. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that Professor Susan Boyson and her colleagues, Dr. Zenzo Moyo and Njabula Zwane, could not have asked for a more appropriate topic to be discussed at such a critical point in our history. So without any further delays, let us get into it. It gives me great pleasure to call upon Dr. Philani Mthembu to address us for about 20 minutes on his paper. Dr. Mthembu is Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, which I think you know is an independent think tank based here in Tshwane, Pretoria. He's completed a joint doctoral program with Freie University Berlin, Renmin University, and with Renmin University Beijing. He has written 1 book, China and India's Development Cooperation in Africa, The Rise of Southern Powers, which in itself is a major achievement, but on top of that, he's co-edited 3 books. And having worked with people that co-edit books, I know what an even bigger achievement that is. He's co-edited From MDGs to Sustainable Development Goals. Then on the MISTRA side, Africa and the World, Navigating Shifting Geopolitics. And then finally, Africa-China Cooperation Towards an African Policy on China. So Philani would be addressing us on his paper, which I hope you have had a chance to look at, China's Belt and Road Initiative, Navigating a Geopolitical Landscape in the Time of COVID-19. Over to you, Philani.
Thank you very much, Abba, and thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us. It really is an honor to also share the stage with Chinese ambassador, but also to share the stage with Dr. Suklal. And in just really having a conversation around a set of ideas and findings in the working paper that I worked with the team from MISTRA. And I must really thank the team from MISTRA for really facilitating this whole process and bringing it to this conclusion. What I will do, colleagues, is I won't sort of read the paper from intro to the end. But what I will do is to just pick a few elements from the paper, from the sections of the paper, to just touch on, which I hope will then essentially lay the foundation for a broader discussion. And I'm doing that also with the assumption that some of you have either read it or browsed through it, and also that some of you may just read it afterwards. And therefore, I don't want to, get too much into sort of a word for word into the paper. It's titled China's Belt and Road Initiative, Navigating a changing geopolitical landscape that's essentially impacted by COVID-19. I think firstly, what I must do is just set the context. I think with COVID-19 essentially being such an impactful matter, which cuts across every aspect of society, here where we are and across the world. I think the key question that was there is, has COVID-19 brought a completely new set of dynamics in the world, or has it actually accelerated what we were already seeing prior to the pandemic? And as far as I have seen, I think I tend to lean more on, of course, there are new elements that are brought into the geopolitical landscape. However, what has been more fascinating for me is how the pandemic has served to essentially accelerate some of the trends that were ongoing prior to the pandemic. I think it's also important to note that whilst we are talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, China has had several other processes prior to this where they have sought to encourage Chinese state and non-state enterprises to essentially move beyond China, sort of a going out strategy, if we remember that previous one. And one could look at the Belt and Road Initiative as almost either a continuation or a different phase of that going out strategy that China had in previous years. I think what's also important to note is the comparisons that have been drawn to, for instance, the Marshall Plan, which of course was spearheaded by the United States in the aftermath of World War II, basically to assist Europe in its post-war recovery efforts, and also with a strategic focus of ensuring that Europe remained very much, at least Western parts of Europe remained very much within the US geopolitical scope, at least. And I think what's important here is that these two are not the same, of course, the Belt and Road and the Marshall Plan. However, what is fascinating is that I think that the conditions of the COVID-19 are actually serving to make the Belt and Road Initiative an even more important plan than it was even prior to the pandemic, because the world is facing a global war against an invisible enemy. COVID-19 has had a disastrous effects on the economies of so many countries. Social protections have been wiped out in many countries. And essentially what the world is looking out for is looking at some of the major countries, the major players in the world, and asking what are the grand strategies and the new plans that are coming that will take the world out of an economic recession that has been essentially brought on by COVID-19. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative is essentially one of the more ambitious plans that have come out amongst the various global actors. I think what's also important in contextualizing the discussion is also some of the key areas highlighted around the 14th five-year plan of the CPC, and how, you know, the pandemic had an effect on some of that planning, essentially initially not coming with an explicit GDP target, but focusing more on the quality of growth in China, focusing on elements such as green growth within China, focusing on innovation, focusing on the dual circulation. And I think some of these elements are quite important for the discussion. So that's just to provide a bit of context. I think the second point is to look at a regional overview of some of the responses of COVID-19 and what that tells us. Essentially, China moved from being the epicenter of the pandemic when, you know, Wuhan was on everyone's lips, but it swiftly moved from being the epicenter to essentially being a provider of assistance for other countries that were now dealing with the COVID-19. And I think what's important here is to look and understand what it means for a post-pandemic global order. The fact that China and Southeast Asian countries have essentially provided some of the key best practices when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. All the various measures that many countries are essentially following, whether it's lockdowns, whether it's quarantine, whether it's social distancing, whether it's additional hygiene measures. We've seen how China and some of its neighbors in Southeast Asia have essentially been at the forefront and relied on their previous experience of dealing with similar SARS epidemics in the past. And they've relied on those experiences to then address the current pandemic. And I think this should pose questions for us looking at the geopolitical landscape. The fact that there was a greater degree of resilience in Southeast Asia to cope with the pandemic. But also, I think what is something to monitor is the fact that when it comes to regional value chains, is that the region has done relatively better than many other regions of the world. And that has made it more resilient. And that should tell us that in the aftermath of the pandemic, that the trends we saw prior to the pandemic, so the movement, you know, from west to east, from north to south, that some of those movements are going to be accelerated, especially as those countries come out of the worst parts of the pandemic much faster than the rest of the world. I think it's also important to note that, you know, whilst we've had that response in China and in Southeast Asia, we also have to look, for instance, at how Europe coped with it, some of the challenges that Europe faced. Now we know that in the EU, health is it really lies with, it's a national competency. It doesn't lie with the European Union. And the EU struggled in the initial stages to coordinate a response around the pandemic. And that is something that is to be noted. In fact, as the pandemic moved away from Southeast Asia in terms of it being the epicenter quickly moved to Europe. I mean, you remember the early days when we were talking about Spain, when we were talking about Italy. It was one of the interesting factors of this pandemic that in the early days, Europe did struggle to coordinate, but also to contain the spread of the virus. It is now obviously implementing an ambitious recovery plan, but I think what's also important to factor is Europe's key transatlantic partner, the United States. The United States has been one of the countries which have been most affected by this pandemic. And in fact, especially under the Trump administration, it was also dealing with domestic challenges that were constraining its ability to be an actor in the world. So these are some of the dynamics that we need to obviously be watching. Of course, there's a new president and a new administration in the US, but I think it's safe to say that many of the disruptive features of the Trump presidency will also act as a constraint to the Biden administration. So it finds itself where it's trying to provide, or to say essentially America is back, but the question is it back to a world? I mean, what type of a world is it coming back to? It's a world that has it learned to live essentially without the US, or to learn to live with a retreating United States? That's an open question. In South and Central America, you also had various challenges of dealing and containing with the pandemic. A country like Brazil, for instance, stands out, which had tremendous challenges. And of course, in the early days, even a sense of denialism when it came to the real health threat that was presented by COVID-19. I think what has been encouraging, though, is the African response to COVID-19 with very limited resources. The continent managed to coordinate a response. It managed to work with international partners such as China and others in terms of coordinating an African response to pool resources, reduce the prices. And I think this was necessitated by the mere fact that Africa found itself at the back of the line when it came to procuring important equipment that would aid it in its response to the pandemic. So, you can see there's been a differentiated approach in the world in terms of dealing with the pandemic. Some regions have done a really good job, but some regions have really struggled in containing it. It's also, I think, going to be important to understand that, whilst you've had analysts who have said that you are likely to have the Belt and Road Initiative being very negatively impacted by the pandemic, the paper argues that some of the features and the key drivers of the Belt and Road Initiative remain as relevant today as they were prior to the pandemic, and therefore that the Belt and Road Initiative, rather than losing momentum, should actually become even more important, not only for China to navigate a post-pandemic order, but also for some of its international partners in realizing certain opportunities that are presented by China. And here, for instance, when I talk about some of the key drivers of the Belt and Road Initiative, I'd like to maybe just highlight a few. Within China, it's important, obviously, for the country to be addressing its own regional disparities. So linking your less developed hinterland in the west of the country to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and other global centers. It's what China has also sought to do is to address the excess capacity and also to migrate some of the surplus factories and productions to other sites of the world. So I think these key drivers, domestic drivers, remain relevant. In terms of some of the key actors, it's going to be important that your Chinese bankers, they will play an important role in terms of ensuring the success of the Belt and Road Initiative. $1 trillion has essentially been committed to the Belt and Road Initiative. And what will be important to monitor is the risk appetite from Chinese state-owned lending institutions, who I argue in the paper have been probably more or have been less risk averse than some of their counterparts in the West, especially when it comes to financing major projects in developing countries. And they will continue to play a driving role in the Belt and Road Initiative. China continues to seek greater connectivity between China, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And that makes the Belt and Road Initiative to remain important for the country. And I think also one key driver also for the importance of the BRI is the changing structure of the Chinese economy towards high-tech manufacturing. So the idea that we used to have of China as a place for cheap labor, cheap manufacturing, massive polluting factories, that is something that is changing very rapidly. And some of, so when we think about the Belt and Road Initiative, we also have to look at it within that context. And that's why I say some of the key domestic and international drivers of the Belt and Road Initiative will remain important, not only for China, but some of its international partners. The last 2 points that I would like to emphasize is that China finds itself in an increasingly confrontational geopolitical landscape, where we have seen the COVID-19 pandemic being politicized. We saw that under the Trump presidency, where he was calling it openly the China virus. That really polluted, I think, the geopolitical landscape and muddied a lot of the waters there. And it is within that environment that China is implementing essentially its Belt and Road Initiative. And what I argue is that despite the fact that a new administration is now in the White House, the political rhetoric and the political environment that was created by the previous administration, if you look at a lot of the polling in the US, you would realize that in terms of levels of trust, for instance, you would see that the American population has, whether Democrats or Republicans, their views on China were negatively affected by that political rhetoric to an extent that I think it will act also as a constraint for the Biden administration to essentially, change its policy on China. There's an increasing challenge in leadership for the transatlantic partners, the US and Europe, and I think their leadership will be tested in this environment. I think there's also a growing populism and economic nationalism within Europe and also in the US, and those trends are also going to act as constraints for the leaders of those particular countries. You just have to think about some of the political rhetoric that happened following the onset of the pandemic, where you've got a growing number of leaders who are pushing to bring the supply chains closer to home, whether it's Japan, whether it's Australia, and some countries in Europe. And I think this is something that is going to be something that is going to be a challenge in terms of navigating that landscape. Another example, just to show that confrontational and politicization of the virus, is we've seen in the World Health Assembly in 2020 Australia leading a charge against China when it came to the pandemic. But at the same time, during the same World Health Assembly, we saw China pledging 2 billion, for instance, towards the global response on the pandemic. And I think what you likely to see, even under a Biden administration, is increasing pressure from the United States directed towards China in either directly or indirectly. And here it would be through, for instance, China's neighborhood. Recently, you had a meeting of the Quad countries, but at the same time, we've seen a ramping up of the rhetoric when it comes to Hong Kong, when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to Xinjiang. And these are some of the areas that the US is likely to focus on in terms of shining a spotlight and posing a challenge towards China. But the paper argues that China essentially should, continue its efforts in terms of looking for an open world order, not looking for confrontation, and in fact working with leaders both in Europe and in other parts of the world who seek cooperation rather than confrontation. But increasingly, that landscape will pose a challenge in terms of the effective implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative. However, because of those domestic and international drivers of the Belt and Road Initiative, with them remaining relevant, I think there is still a global appetite for the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative. The last point in the paper was really on how African countries could work with China on the Belt and Road Initiative in order to build greater resilience for Africa. I said earlier that in terms of the global value chains, we've seen that Southeast Asia has done relatively well. China has done very well when it comes to that. And some of that experience, there's great scope for cooperation with African countries, especially when we think that one of the key weaknesses for Africa was the lack of regional value chains. And without regional value chains, essentially Africa was left vulnerable. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, essentially not only being an opportunity in terms of attracting finance, but it's also an opportunity to attract new industries on the continent, to attract manufacturing in Africa, but also to create that network of regional value chains. And I think if China can work with African counterparts to build greater resilience, to continue building infrastructure, but importantly, cross-border infrastructure in Africa, then I think China will favorably be able to position itself in a changing geopolitical landscape that navigates growing confrontation, but at the same time that realizes that much of the developing world simply wants to be cooperating on development projects in order to recover beyond this pandemic. So those are the 5 sort of key points I wanted to highlight, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Philani. It was a really engaging input. That's why I didn't want to stop you after 20 minutes. But thank you very much for that input. And I just want to say a warm welcome to people that have been joining us as you were presenting. We've got people joining us from Vietnam. We've even got Jürgen Koch, former GIZ that's in Berlin. I'm also glad to welcome the former Director General of DIRCO, Dr. Nsaluba. So welcome everybody. We are privileged to have 2 really distinguished respondents. The first respondent is His Excellency Ambassador Shen Xiaodong, who hails from Anhui Province. He holds an MBA and has had almost 35 years experience in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. Before he took up his posting in South Africa last year, he was Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs. He has served as an ambassador to Singapore and to Iraq. He was minister in the Chinese embassy in the UK, as well as worked as a diplomat in many Arabic-speaking countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Whenever he was back in Beijing between assignments, he served in the ministry's West Asia. I think most of you would know that is the correct terminology for the Middle East, the West Asia and North Africa division, where he rose to the level of head of that department. Ahlan wa sahlan, Your Excellency, over to you. Your Excellency, if you can hold the mic doesn't seem to be coming too clearly. Let's try again. Now it's muted. Let's try. It worked earlier, so let's try again. Yeah, that's better. No, we're losing you again. Sorry. Okay. Not yet. Okay, let's try now. Not yet. Okay, let's wait. Let's wait. We can't hear you yet. We're losing you. Is there a technical issue there? Norma, do you know what's the problem? Hello. We can't hear you. I'm sorry, we can't hear you, Your Excellency. Okay, I think the... Okay, maybe there's a few suggestions. Maybe you should redial in or stop live streaming, the options. Let's redial, yeah. Let's hold for a second. Yeah, I think that's what they're doing, Joe. I think they're redialing in. There we go. Okay, let's try it now.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly. Welcome, Your Excellency.
rejoin. So, Excellency Program Director Omar, Honorable Executive Director Dr. Mthembu, Excellency Deputy Director General Ambassador Suklar, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to attend today's webinar, and I thank MISTRA for the kind invitation. MISTRA is a leading think tank in South Africa, focused, in South Africa, focused on major global and Africa strategic issues deeply valued by various parties. Executive Director Dr. Mthembu is a well-known South Africa scholar and old friend of the Chinese Embassy. DDG of Durko and my old friend Ambassador Suklar is also with us at the webinar. Excellency Ambassador, we look forward to your insightful intervention today. Dr. Mthembu, I have carefully read the working paper, and I am deeply impressed by your insightful perspective, including your just now the address. I would like to commend Dr. Mthembu for his long-standing interest in China, especially through his research on China's COVID-19 response, foreign policies, and the Belt and Road Initiative. The world today is indeed witnessing major changes as well as a pandemic unseen in a century. Complex and deep shifts are taking place in the international order and landscape. In this context, humankind is faced with unprecedented challenges, and the international community needs to work together to help each other overcome these challenges. I would like to take this opportunity to share a few observations. First, in the face of COVID-19, the world needs to work together more than ever to fight the virus. The pandemic has taught us that all countries are in a community shared with shared future, that no one can do well alone in a major crisis, and that solidarity and cooperation are essential to meeting the challenges. As one of the first countries in the world to put COVID-19 under control, China has carried out the largest emergency humanitarian operation since the founding of New China. We contributed our share to the global response. To date, China has provided COVID-19 response assistance to more than 150 countries and 9 international organizations. We dispatched 36 medical expert teams to 34 countries, provided free vaccines to 69 developing countries, and exported vaccines to 43 countries. We provide more than 200 billion masks, 2 billion pieces of protective clothing, and 800 million testing kits. In the fight against the virus, China and Africa have looked out for and helped each other in solidarity and cooperation. We once again demonstrate a brotherhood of tiding over difficulty. The two sides jointly proposed to hold the extraordinary China-Africa Summit on solidarity against COVID-19 to discuss pandemic response and show mutual support. China has so far provided nearly 120 batches of emergency PPEs to Africa and sent medical experts to 15 African countries. We have provided and will provide vaccines to a total of 35 African countries, as well as AU. The construction of the Africa CDC headquarters with Chinese assistance has already kicked off, and cooperation between 30 pairs of Chinese and African hospitals are also being advanced quickly. Second, in the face of the changing international landscape, the world needs to practice multilateralism more than ever. This pandemic has once again proved that a zero-sum approach cannot solve national problems or deal with international challenge. However, some individual countries and politicians are creating obstacles in the global response to the pandemic. They are making self-centered moves to do damage by smearing, slandering, and making political virus against others. Those practices undermine global efforts against the pandemic and will surely be rejected by people in the world and by history. Just now, Ambassador Omar and also Mthembu speak about China-US relations. What I want to say is that China-US relations have been in the past 4 years escalated with more tensions. The fundamental reason is that the US does not accept China's sustainable development and worry about possible challenge for their hegemony. And you can see over the past years, the US leverage all the means such as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan issues to smear, to attack and contain China. And the new Biden administration has, on the one hand, pledged to review China policies of the Trump era. And on the other hand, they still leverage China as its most serious competitor. And we all know tomorrow China and the US will hold a high-level dialogue. It will be the first high-level contact between the two sides. We hope that through this dialogue, the two sides could build relations based on non-conflict, non-confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. And through dialogue, we can manage differences and promote the sound and steady development of China-US relations. And as a responsible major countries, China has always advocated and practiced multilateralism. We firmly uphold the UN-centered international system and the basic norms of international relations with the UN Charter as a cornerstone. We actively promote the development of global governance system towards a more just and reasonable direction. China has always adhered to the path of peaceful development. We work to foster a new type of international relations and a community with a shared future for mankind. We will forever be a builder of a world peace, a contributor to global development, and a defender of the international order. As the world's largest developing country, China will always stand together with developing countries, including Africa. No matter how the international situation evolves, China will never waver in its determination to strengthen China-Africa solidarity and cooperation. We will always be a sincere friend and a reliable partner of Africa. Third, with a global economy in deep recession, the world needs a coordinated response more than ever. For the first time in history, the virus has caused major global economies huge damage all at the same time. And there is now great uncertainties in the prospect of global recovery. In order to secure recovery and development post-COVID-19, it's important to be even more committed to intensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits so as to achieve win-win cooperation and common development. President Xi Jinping has stressed on many occasions that the BRI is not a geopolitical tool,
I don't understand why you don't learn.
But a pragmatic cooperation platform. It's not a foreign aid program, such as my colleague just mentioned, the Marshall Plan, but a joint development initiative that honors extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefit. The BRI has shown strong resilience and vigor in the face of COVID-19. Here, I would like to share with you some new information. In 2020, China's trade in goods with countries along the road grew by 0.7% year on year. Our non-financial direct investment in BRI partner countries increased by 18.3% year on year. In the first 2 months of this year, China's trade with BRI countries totaled 1.62 trillion yuan, up 23.9% year on year. The family of China-Africa Belt and Road cooperation is growing stronger, with 46 African countries having signed BRI cooperation documents with China. Despite the impact of COVID-19, more than 1,100 BRI projects in Africa are operating against the odds. Nearly 100,000 Chinese technical and engineering personnel are still working hard in Africa, and the number of railroad, highway, and power station projects have resumed, making important contributions to local economic and social development. Ladies and gentlemen, China's prospects of sustainable development are very promising. As China works to balance pandemic response and economic recovery, we have achieved a growth of 2.3% in 2020, which means we are the only major economy in the world to achieve positive growth. This year, China's economic growth is expected to hit about 6%, contributing more than 1/3 of global growth. President Xi Jinping has recently announced that nearly 100 million Chinese rural residents living under the current poverty line have been lifted out of poverty. This means that China has completed the arduous task of eradicating absolute poverty and fulfill the poverty reduction targets of UN Agenda 2030, 10 years ahead of schedule. China's achievement in poverty reduction has not only made significant contributions to global development, but also explore feasible paths for developing countries to achieve development and prosperity. This year marks the centenary of the Communist Party of China. With 100 years of history, the party is still moving forward like an energetic young people. As China enters a new stage of development, upholds the new development philosophy, and fosters a new development paradigm under CPC's leadership, is like a China Express with stronger power and greater carrying capacity, accelerating towards new growth. We will further open up to the outside world, better connect the two major markets at home and abroad, better integrate and coordinate import and exports, and help accelerate the building of an open world economy. Ladies and gentlemen, China and Africa are true friends, good partners, and real brothers with each other. China-Africa cooperation has set a fine example for South-South cooperation and international cooperation with Africa. No matter how the international situation changes, China and Africa will always be a community of shared future. African friends are most welcome to get on board the express train of China's economic development to achieve win-win cooperation and common development. To this end, I would like to make a 3-point proposal. First, it's important to work together to meet challenges and further deepen solidarity and cooperation in COVID-19 response. As the virus is still raging in Africa and around the world, China is ready to work with the Africa side to implement the outcomes of last year's extraordinary summit on solidarity against COVID-19. We are ready to promote China-Africa cooperation in health, resumption of work and production, and the improvement of people's livelihood. We are ready to continue to provide PPEs, share experience in response, carry out vaccine cooperation, promote cooperation between paired up Chinese and Africa hospitals, and accelerate the building of Africa CDC headquarters according to African needs. China will move forward vaccine cooperation with African countries. We are also exploring vaccine cooperation with South Africa, including the local production of vaccine so that the South African people will benefit from Chinese vaccine at an earlier date. In the context of COVID-19, we are willing to work together with our African friends to build a China-Africa community of health for all and set a good example for global health cooperation. Second, it's important to use collective cooperation mechanism to further expand the areas of win-win cooperation between China and Africa. The next FOCAC meeting will be held in Senegal in the fourth quarter of 2021. China and Africa are actively preparing for and designing the outcomes of the meeting to promote cooperation post-COVID-19, to better meet the needs of both sides and to work towards higher quality and more benefits to the people's livelihood. China is ready to work with the Africa side to strengthen connection between the BRI as well as AU's Agenda 2063 and the development strategies of each country. We are ready to improve the mix of production capacity investment and to upgrade China-Africa cooperation with improved qualities. China is ready to take the opportunities delivered by the new development paradigm and the launch of AFCFTA to import more of Africa high-quality products and strengthen the links between the two supply chains. We are ready to expand cooperation in the digital economy, smart cities, clean energy, 5G, and other new models of businesses, promote the circulation of both the Chinese and Africa economies, and jointly build a market of 2.7 billion people in China and Africa. Third, it's important to strengthen international solidarity and collaboration to firmly safeguard the common interest of developing countries. It's a common responsibility of the international community to support Africa's development, and countries need to cooperate with Africa based on respect for Africa's sovereignty and voice. China firmly supports Africa's active participation in international affairs and in boosting its international influence. We are ready to strengthen strategic communication with the Africa side on major international and regional issues in a timely manner and safeguard the common interests of developing countries. We are ready to work with Africa to oppose external interference, safeguard fairness and justice, and promote a more equitable and reasonable international order. However, at present, China and Africa are more likely to get information about each other through Western media, which makes easy misinterpretation and even misunderstanding. The right to tell beautiful stories of China-Africa cooperation should be in the hands of the Chinese and African peoples, and not third parties who only seek to skew facts and discredit others with ulterior motives. In this regard, I sincerely hope that the press, scholars, and think tanks of China and South Africa can explore new ideas. It would be useful to use online exchanges to enhance communication, to provide more comprehensive, impartial, and genuine perspective, as well as to deliver intellectual support and create a good public opinions atmosphere for China-Africa friendship and cooperation. The Chinese embassy in South Africa is also very much ready to provide necessary support and facilitation to that end. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. That was a wonderful sketching out of the perspectives and giving us a lot of food for thought. I also want to say a warm welcome to all your colleagues that have joined you as well. I understand they will also be available to participate in the discussion. I see some questions have been coming in the sidebar on the chat section. So if colleagues can start looking at that and maybe start preparing your answers when we have the discussion. Also, I should have mentioned that the Singapore ambassador to South Africa has joined us from Singapore. So welcome, TK. Good to see you part of this discussion as well. So last but not least, my fellow student activist, my former boss, Ambassador Dr. Professor Anil Suklaw. Anil is Deputy Director General responsible for Asia and the Middle East at DIRCO. He's been in the Department of Foreign Affairs since 1995. Now, some of you may know that a Sherpa is the personal representative of a head of state or government who prepares for an international summit. And it is derived from the Nepalese guides who help climbers traverse, especially the Himalayan mountains. He is South Africa's Sherpa, so he's the president's personal representative for Brics, G20, IPSA, and focal point for the Indian Ocean Rim and FOCAC that the ambassador mentioned, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. He served as South Africa's ambassador to the EU, Belgium, and Luxembourg from 2006 to 2012, and also at our missions in Geneva and New Delhi. He is the holder of 2 doctorates. I'm not sure how you manage that, Anil. I barely finished my doctorate a few years ago, so well done on that. He has published more than 20 articles and has been the recipient of a number of fellowships and awards, including several in China and India's prestigious Pravasi Bharatiya Samman Award. Over to you, Anil.
Thank you, Eva. When I try to switch my video on, it says that the host has switched it off.
The host should deal with that immediately. There we go.
Good. Thank you. Let me firstly thank you, Eva, for those kind words. You were, after all, my student leader during our good old days at the University of Durban, Westville. And I had the privilege to work with you as a diplomat. Let me thank MISTRA for taking this initiative and hosting this webinar on a very pertinent topic. My greetings to Ambassador Chen, my good friend and colleague, and to all of those present in the webinar, and including our chief guest, Dr. Philani Mthembu. It's always good to listen to Dr. Mthembu. Let me thank you for your very insightful paper, Philani, and your valuable input that you made this afternoon, all of which I agree with. Let me firstly also say, Eba, that I fully agree with your three C's, but I had already articulated my 4 C's that I was going to share with the webinar today. And in my view, we live in an era that is characterized by 4 C's, namely cooperation, competition, contestation, and containment. This is what is shaping the geopolitical landscape in which we find ourselves at the present time in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Of course, this is also complicated by the politics of the pandemic and the vaccine. I fully agree with Philani's reading that the COVID pandemic has brought about new dynamics, while at the same time, it has accelerated some of the fault lines that was there prior to COVID-19. Now, interestingly, Thomas Friedman, in his 2017 book, Thank You for Being Late, characterized our present age as the age of disruption and the age of acceleration. I think he was a bit prophetic because this was coined in 2017, and yes, the pandemic has brought about an age of disruption in our livelihoods and in the global community. And at the same time, it has brought about an age of acceleration in all fronts that we find ourselves in. You have referred to some of the geopolitical dynamics that have characterized the global scenario over the past few years under the Trump administration, what has happened in bilateral relations between the USA and China, what has happened on the multilateral front in terms of the rise of unilateralism and populism and bullyism, as President Xi refers to some of these actions, and the impact that has had on all of us, including South Africa and Africa. Now, of course, I want to make an assertion at the very beginning of my presentation. Neither COVID nor any global entity can prevent the rise of China. That's a fait accompli. China is a major power today and will become a superpower very soon. McKinsey report of last month has stated that by 2028, China will be the largest global economy. That's a matter of fact. No containment policy can prevent that. And looking at China and the Belt and Road Initiative, I think for Africa, it is important for us to first understand China and its commitment to the developing world, its commitment to South-South cooperation, its solidarity to South-South cooperation, and the way it conducts itself in its bilateral and multilateral relations with Africa, the global South, and the global North. Now, I think it's important for us to remember that last year marked the 70th anniversary of the launch of China's Development Cooperation Program. The CPC came to power in 1949, and within a year, China, despite the serious domestic challenges that it faced, and the levels of poverty and underdevelopment were extreme. We all are aware of this history. But China set forth on a program of development cooperation as early as 1950. And last year, we marked the 50th anniversary of that development cooperation program. Another very important development that we should take cognizance of is that in January this year, China released the 3rd edition of its white paper on development cooperation. And I think it's very important to understand how China sees its development cooperation program. And this is the first white paper released since the founding of the China International Development Cooperation Agency, CIDCA, that was launched in 2018. And it clearly articulates its program of development cooperation on the global front. And Africa features prominently in this program. Now, China is officially the world's largest creditor to the developing countries today. This status has come with a great deal of attention, both negative and positive. Issues such as transparency or alleged debt trap diplomacy have dominated global debates. But the question remains, what is objectively true and what is speculation? The white paper marks a break from the past. It refers to development cooperation rather than aid. This move is consistent with CIDCA's naming, which drew attention in 2018 for the very same reasons I've mentioned. 3 outcomes of China's development cooperation white paper are the following. China broadens its model of development cooperation. For the first time, the Belt and Road Initiative, which combines investment, development, and trade objectives, is formally included within the development cooperation framework of the white paper, cementing the Belt and Road's position at the core of China's development efforts. The white paper sees China continuing to open up global engagement with the possibility of new partnerships warranting an entire chapter in the paper. China's Development Assistance Committee, donors and/or multilateral agencies will increasingly drive a trilateral agenda. While trilateral pilot projects were mentioned in earlier editions, this white paper notably features wider bureau-level discussions held with both Japan and the EU. And this is significant because China is looking at partnership with other global role players, including the involvement in Africa through TCAD, through the India-Africa, Turkey-Africa, Arab-Africa programs. China has been looking and speaking of trilateral cooperation and not working just in isolation of other programs. And this is something we, as Africa and the African Union, have been asking of our development cooperation partners in terms of the various programs that they have with Africa, to find a coordinated and synergized way in which our partners, including China, interact with Africa, and China has started this process. It's also encouraging commitments on aid effectiveness and transparency. Now, there has been many questions around aid transparency with regard to China and Africa. This constantly features on the agenda in our bilateral interactions with our partners from the North. Now, China has made this policy in this new edition of the white paper. The white paper addresses the issue of aid effectiveness principles, which addresses some of the criticisms leveled at China regarding the substantive gains from aid or cooperation in doing so. It also tackles head-on some prominent criticism leveled against China's aid. Importantly, in terms of the principles of ownership of development priorities by developing countries, the document indicates that projects under the BRI should dovetail with the development strategies of participating countries. Now, this is what we have been saying, not only in terms of our partnership with China around the BRI, but within FOCAC as well. This is something that we have called for, and we have cemented this in the FOCAC outcome documents in the summit outcome of 2015 here in Johannesburg and the 2018 summit outcome document, in keeping in line with Agenda 2063 and its first 10-year program of action. In order to strengthen and guard against corruption, China commits to strengthening the performance appraisal mechanism for entities undertaking projects. The white paper offers few concessions towards greater transparency. In terms of the data that the aid should be directed to needs of the LDCs. Now, it's interesting to note that between 2013 and 2018, China's aid grew by almost 44%. From 1.7 billion, it moved up to 7 billion since the last 15, 20 years. And 45% of that cooperation came to Africa. The bulk of it came to Africa. And the majority of that development cooperation program went to LDCs in Africa. So, and China's development cooperation is seen within the framework of South-South cooperation. So many questions are being raised now about the impact of the pandemic on the global economy, including China's economy. And Ambassador Chen pointed out that there were only 2 G20 economies that grew positively last year, that of Turkey and China. China grew by 2.3% significantly. And China also, its GDP for the first time surpassed 100 trillion yuan. That's a milestone. Interestingly, our trade with most of our partners globally declined last year, and that is expected given the devastation to the global economy, including our own economies here in South Africa and Africa. But our trade with Africa, with China, actually grew positively last year. Our two-way trade with China reached at least 417 billion rands from 370 billion in 2019. Now, I think that's a positive indication of the strength and resilience of the Chinese economy, and that is good for South Africa and good for the African continent. One of the things that is very clear, and President Xi said this in his opening remarks during the twin sessions that were held last week, reflecting on the 13th five-year program, that they have achieved all of the goals set under the 13th five-year program as they unveiled the 14th five-year program. And Dr. Philani spoke specifically at some of the focus area of China under the 14th five-year plan and its 15-year plan going up to 2035. Now, the point I'm making here is that when China makes commitments, and I've had a 40-year association with China, 25 years through DIRCO and 15 years as an academic. China never goes back on its commitments, and China fulfills its commitments, whatever commitments it makes. Therefore, I have no doubt that the commitments made under the Belt and Road, and today some 20 African countries have signed MOUs with China under the Belt and Road architecture. South Africa was the first country in 2015 when President Xi came here for the FOCAC summit. It was preceded by a state visit. And during that state visit, we became the first African country to sign an MOU with China, which at that stage was still referred to as the One Belt, One Road concept, which we refer to now as the BRI. Of course, China today only holds 14% of sub-Saharan Africans' debt, only 14%. But this sometimes is blown out of proportion in terms of China's deep involvement on the African continent, especially China's involvement in Africa's economy and in terms of Africa's infrastructure build. Now, the recent McKinsey report that was released points out that today China finances 1 in 5 infrastructure projects on the African continent. And China and Chinese SOEs are responsible for building 3 out of 5 infrastructure projects on the African continent. Now, it's important to recognize as we mark, last year we marked the 20th anniversary of FOCAC. I was very privileged to be part of the South African delegation in 2000 when FOCAC was launched. I was present there and part of the discussions. And we never dreamt when we assembled in Beijing for the first ministerial that this program will become such an important flagship program in terms of China-Africa cooperation and set a new benchmark in terms of cooperation between a country and Africa. And as we marked the 20th anniversary, there were several milestones that we could look back on in terms of China's involvement in the African continent over the past 20 years, formal involvement under the FOCAC architecture, the thousands of kilometers of rail line that have been built, thousands of kilometers of roadways, of ports that have been developed. Some 80,000 Chinese, South African students are studying in China at the present time. In terms of skills and capacity building, China has been a major force in terms of capacitating Africa. These are just some examples where Africa has benefited directly as a result of the partnership with Africa. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative provides a further avenue. And I've indicated that some 20 countries are now involved under the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, these initiatives must be seen as complementary. They're not separate compartments. China's partnership with Africa under FOCAC, it's a dynamic partnership addressing our needs under the Africa that we want, Agenda 2063. The Belt and Road Initiative focuses heavily on infrastructure in helping Africa position itself to become a major global player as its economy rises. The point was made by Philani that today Africa has a population of 1.3 billion. It's projected to grow to 1.7 billion by 2030 and 2.4 billion by 2050. 65% of the population will be a youthful population. And Africa is on the rise. There is a scramble for Africa. This terminology has been used repeatedly, but that's the reality. Everyone wants a piece of Africa. And it's important for us to be in charge of these relationships, the way we construct this relationship so that we do not see Africa as a terrain of contestation to our detriment. And therefore, the synergy between the various partnerships must be there, and the African Union and us as bilateral partners must be at the forefront of these relationships. It's very easy to criticize and say that the Belt and Road Initiative is a blueprint for global domination. The mere fact is that our life is dominated by Western powers today. The Coke we drink, the McDonald's we eat, the Burger King we eat, the perfumes that our wives and girlfriends use, the clothes that we use, whether it's Adidas or Nike or Yves Saint Laurent or whatever you have, the Hollywood movies that we digest on Netflix and the cinemas. All of this dominate our lives, but no one makes an issue of this. But because China is rising And China wants to play a positive role in shaping this new global architecture. Let us work with this rising power. You cannot stop this rise of China. Before the Industrial Revolution, India and China dominated the global economy for 2 millennia. That's the reality. And you're going to see, as the McKinsey report speaks of the rise of China, the largest economy by 2028, and by 2032, India will become the third largest global economy. Much is made about tensions between India and China. They are Brics partners. They are partners in the SCO. They are neighbors. I've said that I have been involved in Chinese and Indian history for almost 40 years. They have coexisted for over 2,000 millennia. Yes, there'll be competition because you have two giants rising. There's going to be discomfort and elbow rubbing and elbow bruising along the way. But they will find accommodation eventually as these two countries rise to become major global powers that will shape the history of the world in future for a better world and a more equitable world and a more inclusive world. President Xi, I think when President Xi took power as General Secretary of the CPC and as President of the People's Republic of China, he was very clear that he wants to work for the creation of a better world, a community of shared future for mankind, as he coined the term, and which he has repeatedly echoed, not only in bilateral meetings, but in multilateral meetings. It's not just a catchphrase that he goes about saying. China has put resources into its programs, development programs with the world. Africa has much to gain out of this partnership. We all know our own history and how the apartheid government warned us about the rise of communism in South Africa and what it will do to our lives. Now, this is what is being waved about globally by some powers that do not want to share the high table and want to continue dominating the high table. That's the history of our past, the history of our future. And this decade, I've stated that this decade is going to be a decisive decade. The world of 2030 is going to be vastly different. The pandemic is just one of the challenges we have seen. I'm not going to go into the pandemics, the details of the pandemics. I think Philani and Ambassador Chen has covered that adequately. We saw that as soon as the pandemic was running riot with the global community, it was President Xi who called for a special FOCAC summit that was co-chaired by President Macky Sall in his capacity as the current chair or co-chair of FOCAC, and President Ramaphosa in his capacity as AU chair. You had this meeting that brought the African leadership together to see how China could work with Africa to address the challenges posed by the pandemic. And China was the only country to come forward to call for such a summit and put forward initiatives, and China put resources on the table. That has been spoken of. And of course, what you see today in vaccine and pandemic politics, the whole issue of vaccines, it also, you see it now in Europe with AstraZeneca, you saw it in South Africa. And the reality is you have three Brics countries, Russia, China, and India, that was at the forefront of coming out with vaccines against the pandemic. That's a major milestone. And I think that's something that's underreported, and that's something we should take cognizance of, that previously this space was dominated by the developing world, the developed world. But now you have three countries from the developing South that have come forward and dominating the space. And that changes the global health politics in a dramatic way, not just the global health politics, but the global geodynamics going forward. So I think I'm going to not go into any further detail. I can continue speaking for a while, but I think we want to have some time to listen and interact with our colleagues. We had very good inputs from Ambassador Chen and Philani, but I can sum up by saying, firstly, you cannot stop the rise of China. COVID will not stop it, nor will any entity stop the rise of China. China is on the verge of becoming a global superpower. That's the reality. We have to live with that. And secondly, the China-Africa friendship and cooperation is on solid footing. It's on solid footing, and Africa has much to gain. Yes, there are some fault lines that needs to be addressed, but that's the value of the strong friendship that we have with China, that we can engage China robustly and tell them that we need to look differently at how we do things. I remember the first FOCAC meeting in Beijing. It was a very rough meeting because China didn't understand Africa and we didn't understand China. It was the first time you had a so-called mass meeting, all 50 plus, well, there were close to 50 countries then. Some were still in the camp of Taiwan. But all of us were there, and for the first time in a face-to-face meeting, trying to understand each other. When we were going to China in 2018, when I had to brief President Ramaphosa, he asked me, what was the value of us co-chairing FOCAC for the past 6 years? I said, Mr. President, one of the most valuable lessons of FOCAC since its formation and including our past 6 years of co-chair is that China has got to appreciate and understand the African mind better. And we as Africans have got to appreciate and understand the Chinese way of thinking better. We have found each other. And that for me was the most valuable lesson of this partnership, taking it forward. So secondly, this China-Africa cooperation, whether it is within the paradigm of FOCAC or the paradigm of the Belt and Road, and we must not forget, you also have the South-South Cooperation Fund, where Africa is a beneficiary. You also have the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Today, 10 African countries are members of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And last year, that bank disbursed its first loan to an African country for 3 projects to the value of 600 million in Egypt. There are a further 9 countries that are in talk to become prospective members of the AIIB. That's another avenue open to Africa in terms of addressing its infrastructure deficit. As I've said, according to African Development Bank, Africa's infrastructure deficit needs is anything between 70 to 110 billion US dollars. So we have all of these structures in this partnership that we have to utilize. And the pandemic has been a hiccup, but it's also an opportunity for us to reset relations, because the pandemic gives us an opportunity to reset global relations. But I'm not optimistic. Actually, I think as Philani has stated, the pandemic has only exacerbated the fault lines that were there and widened these fault lines. You're going to see new configurations in terms of power dynamics. You're going to see new groupings emerge. Already the G7 is speaking of a D10 when they meet in Britain this year. So you're going to see more and more of these configurations. But for South Africa and Africa, we have to be alert to these challenges and not get caught up in these geopolitical dynamics, but ensure that we navigate these dynamics to the benefit of our country and the benefit of the African continent, because we have much to gain from this very important and dynamic partnership that continues to grow and will continue to flourish between China and the African continent. Thank you, colleagues, for having me to share some of my views on this very interesting webinar that you have arranged under MISTRA's umbrella. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Suklal. I know it's difficult to try and distill so many decades of experience in just 20 minutes, but thank you for all the background and the passion you brought to the topic. So we've got quite a few questions, and I'm going to just raise this generally, and then I'm going to ask, as we have had the order of speakers, if you can address them, but I'm going to be a little bit stricter and give you about 5-7 minutes each to answer any of the questions that are raised. I think the first question would be, given that India is in the Quad, what does this mean about the future of Brics? Will there be, and also we've seen the tensions along the India-China border, so that's the one. The second question is, how do we avoid a disastrous humanitarian crisis in developing countries as we emerge from the pandemic lockdowns? Will it be harder or easier to attain economic justice? And how does this relate to the BRI? So that's second. The third one was, are Chinese vaccine researchers and producers able to test the effectiveness of the vaccines against new variants, including the one first identified in South Africa? Then how has China's attainment of a strategic position in the global economy and geopolitics impacted on its assessment of its own rights and responsibilities in the global arena? Then there's another question on the side chat was, is China's commitment to solidarity genuine? And then there's one that, what are the selection criteria considering the delivery of vaccines to Africa from China? Will these be donations or are they priced? And then how do we handle the absorption capacity of health services in Africa? Does China engage in capacity development projects to tackle the serious bottleneck? Then another question was, the pandemic has posed difficulties for many sub-Saharan countries that have borrowed hugely to fund infrastructure projects. How is this being dealt with by China? Will there be debt relief? And then is it true that many of the infrastructure in Africa are funded and carried out by Chinese regions, by Chinese companies, sorry. So I'm opening that out for any of the speakers to take a shot at. Philani, maybe we should start with you and then we can go to the Chinese embassy. I understand the ambassador may have to be leaving at some point, but the embassy official have indicated they wouldn't mind dealing with some of the questions. And then Anil, you can wrap it up after that. Over to you, Philani.
Thanks, Abba. If the host could just switch my video on.
Yes, we'd love to see you.
There we go. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So thank you. That was really quite fascinating, listening also to the responses. And I think they really added a lot of wealth to this discussion. Some interesting questions, and I will, be strict on myself in listening to the chair very briefly. I think when looking at India and the Quad, it's important to take into account what was said, by Dr. Suklal, in a sense that India, yes, is part of the Quad, but India is also a very important member of the Brics. In fact, India is hosting the Brics this year, and I think what we always have to take into account is, when the ambassador spoke earlier, is that often we get an idea of our respective countries through other media. And of course, because of the dominance of Western media, we often get our news through or filtered through a Western lens. And I think it's important to understand that whilst you may have, tensions flaring up every now and then between India and China, is that India always, like other major countries, is what they seek is some kind of autonomy, strategic autonomy in the way it handles its international relations. So one way, of course, of looking at it is yes, whether the Quad is sort of aimed as a response to the rise of China. But on the other hand, if you look at it maybe from India's perspective, is you would also see it as India trying to open up its own strategic autonomy in international relations. So the Quad is not an end in itself, for a country like India. The Quad is one amongst several setups and platforms that India uses in order to play a growing role in the world. So I think we must never forget, that India is part of several other, configurations. And one of those important ones is the Brics, and India is hosting Brics this year. I think on vaccines, I think it's going to be important that, yes, we sort of continue to follow the developments in China, the efficacy with regards the variant that is found mostly here in South Africa. But I would certainly, as a fellow BRICS country, want to see greater cooperation amongst the BRICS countries when it comes to the vaccines. I mean, we've heard that Russia, China, and India are playing a very proactive role when it comes to the vaccine. They are not only rolling out vaccinations within their countries, they are also, sharing those vaccines with other parts of the world. And many of the times through essentially donations to those various countries. And I think this is quite important because what it speaks to is the critique that South Africa has been consistent on vaccine nationalism, and that you cannot overcome this pandemic unless you are making vaccines available not only for your own population, but for others. Because if you only focus on your own population, then more strains are going to emerge. And then eventually, the vaccines that you are using are probably going to be less effective against some of those newer strains. In terms of China's rise and how it shapes its own image of itself and its responsibilities in the world, I think it's been quite important and evident that there is a shift in mindset from China. I think China does understand that it has greater responsibilities, greater expectations, both in China, but also outside of China. And this has really been heralded by the period of President Xi Jinping. I think you've seen China becoming more confident in both domestically, but also in international affairs. And you've also seen China taking on greater responsibilities. And the Belt and Road Initiative is one of those. We saw when the US withdrew financial support and left the World Health Organization, how China essentially upped its contributions to the World Health Organization. So I do think there's a changing perception, self-perception of China's own responsibilities. I think China understands that as it plays a stronger role in the world, as it becomes more confident within China, that it will have to play a greater role. And in fact, this is welcome because we are living in a world that has been largely dominated by Western countries. And I think adding a few other voices from the global South can only contribute. Yes, I think China does play a role when it comes to capacity building. Ambassador Suklal spoke about China's aid policy. What we saw is that whilst many people associate China with the large infrastructure projects, is that over the years, China has also become a greater player when it comes to building Africa's soft infrastructure. So people-to-people relations, training of people, sending students to China to receive technical training. And I think you're getting a stronger role in terms of capacity building. And then lastly, in terms of infrastructure projects, I think, when it comes to some of the complaints out there, and there's a lot of disinformation, firstly, when it comes to projects. One of those areas of disinformation is that China hires mostly Chinese workers. That's just not practical, and it wouldn't make sense even for China. It would hike their costs so much. Empirical research over the last few years has shown that there is between 70 to 95% employment of the local population when it comes to major infrastructure projects within Africa. And there's research that's done by several institutions. So if you cross-reference that, you see that it's quite an accurate reflection. And then I think in terms of regulations, so regulations of workers' rights and so forth, I think it's important for African countries to also take ownership, because what we have seen is that you are only as good as your ability to regulate and enforce your own regulations as a country. So when your regulations are strong, when your oversight is strong, you find that the results are also stronger. But in countries with weaker regulations, with less oversight, you would find that you would have, more challenges when it comes to certain projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Philani. Well done. You've captured it all very nicely. I think you've touched on all the questions. Well done. If I can call upon anyone from the Chinese embassy, if they would like to respond to any of the questions. Thank you.
Hello, Excellencies. Your Excellencies.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Oh, pleasure to meet you. My name is Ouyang Zhibing. I'm the counselor inside the Chinese embassy. Unfortunately, our ambassador, His Excellency Mr. Qin Xiaodong, has another function at 4, so he has to leave. But I'm pleased to answer your questions. Thank you very much for the audience and also for Dr. Mthembu and His Excellency Ambassador Sukla. You give a very in-depth analysis of China's rising, China's BRI, and also China-Africa relationship. I'm very enjoyed about that. And also I know that China is a very hot topic now, not only in Africa, but also among the world. So thank you very much for the questions. I'd like to, because of the time limit, I can only pick some. Hopefully I can answer your concern. The first question is regarding China's vaccines, whether it's effective to the variant, for example, to the variant in South Africa. I think that's a question for the scientists. It should be answered as in a perspective of science, because until now, the variant was first discovered last year, if I remember correctly, last October in UK and then in South Africa, and the scientists are still studying for it. So until now, I don't think the accurate data for whether China's vaccines is effective for the variant. I think that is a challenge not only for Chinese vaccines, but also for other vaccines like the Johnson and others. So, but I think we can jointly cooperate together, and also China's vaccines are used in some African countries, and even for us, we are discussing the emergency use in South Africa, but it needs a long procedure even for the emergency use. So there are some you need some experiment, you need some data. So I think that's need time. But the Chinese vaccines are proved to be very effective for the coronavirus. I mean, not for the variant until now. The second question is about China's attainment. If I understand correctly, it's about how China is rising and how China, on the one hand, shoulder its responsibilities, and on the other hand, how to preserve its own right. Just now, His Excellency Ambassador Sukla said it very clearly that China's rising is unstoppable. It's a trend, it's a tendency. Whether we see China will be the number one, whether in the next 10 years or 20 years, it's not a big question, I think. But I must say that China is a big power. It's a world power, not only because of a GDP, but also because it's population. China has 1.4 billion people. That is the number of the whole continent, nearly. So I think China, we showed the responsibilities to preserve the world peace, to promote the prosperity, and to advance the development. That is the one point. And also China, we are a strong promoter of multilateralism, and we safeguard the principles and of UN Charter, and also we showed our responsibilities. For example, China is the largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping, and also we attended nearly all the peacekeeping operations in Africa. I think that is one contribution to the world peace. And also China's development as the largest consumer market in the world. We provided opportunities for the whole world, just like Ambassador explained. China is like a fast track. We welcome our African friends and friends all over the world to board it. So in the past 10 years or nearly 20 years, China's contribution to the world economic growth surpassed 30%. And I think as China is growing on with our new paradigm That is not to say we are just focusing on our domestic. We are not opening up. That is a misunderstanding. We will open wider. And that means we will provide more opportunities for the whole world. And also for our African friends, some audience asked this question about how BRI should accommodate all with the African continent free trade area. I think that is a very good question, because for the BRI, there are 5 connectivities, among which one is the trade connectivities. You know, last year even faced the challenge of COVID-19. China's trade with this continent is also over 190 billion US dollars. That is, you know, it's downgrade, but only a minus. And if you compare it to other major trade partners with Africa, China is still the first. I think in the next after the pandemic, there are more opportunities. For example, with the free trade area, China we will import more products from Africa. For example, now we have imported wines and beefs from South Africa, and also we imported some fruits from Kenya. I think the gate will be wider. And also, some audience, they ask the infrastructure, China's infrastructure. Of course, China is the largest contributor to Africa's infrastructure. And we built the roads, the ports, the railways, highways, schools. There's an amount. There's a lot. And I think during this process, China is related. This question is related to China's debt. I mean, the African's debt with China. First of all, China is not the largest debt. We are not the, China does not occupy the largest number. You know, it's still the international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and also the Paris Club, and also the private sectors, they occupy the largest. So I think China, we did a lot to alleviate the debt burdens of our African friends. For example, in the G20 platform, we attended the DSSI, and we have also waived the debts of over 15 countries. And also we during the FOCAC, inside the FOCAC framework, we have waived the zero interest concessional loans of 16 countries. You know, the debt problem, if we may call it, it's a very complicated question. It can be not solved one day. You know, as our African friends, we have in the history there are several debt waves, and also the alleviation and the wave and the debt, how to solve this question. So I think we because for the debt issue that I have when I was working in Beijing, I have attended some negotiations. For example, the negotiations with Ethiopia. I must say it's very complicated. You know, it should be case by case. There's no there's no rule, or there's not a frame fit for all. Just like there's no one shoes fit all. So I think the most practical and the best way is to case by case and country by country. As a true friend of Africa, we will never, just as some Western media described, we will never seize the property, the strategic assets of our African friends. That's not the friends do. And also we will never push our Africans. For example, we will not give the limit For example, which year or by the end of this year you must pay it, or otherwise we will cut the trade or we will stop the assistance. That is not the approach of China side. So I think for the debt problem, it is critical, especially for the Africa's recovery after the COVID-19. I think China attached great importance to it, and we are cooperating with our African friends to handle it. And also, may I to see another question is about China's assistance of vaccine to African friends, whether there's any criteria. I must say there is no. You know, we treat our friends equally. African friends are all our friends. You know, we just as we never set political conditions or other political attachment to our assistance. There's no. Just as President Xi announced, China's vaccine will be the global public goods. We will provide it to any country that need it. But you know, it's of course, it's restricted by the production capacity. And also, as I mentioned before, there are some prerequisites, even for South Africa, for example, not to see China's vaccine can enter easily. You know, we must meet the criteria, we must get the approval of the medical authorities from South Africa. And as maybe you have mentioned that China we have provided, there are 2 ways. There are 2 ways for China to provide vaccine to African continent and other countries. One is donation. We have donated vaccines to like Zambia, like Namibia, and some other African countries. And another is through market. I think that is the main channel, or we must say that's the main channel. You know, because vaccine until now it's a public goods. Even we call it public goods, it's a good. Good should be solved through market, I think. But the price and the quantity, we would like to talk with our African friends. So that is my, if I may see, that is my questions my answers for these questions. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Excellency.
Thank you very much, my dear colleague, and really appreciate the frankness with which you've answered it, because I think it's so important that we do get your perspective on these issues. Last but not least, I'm going to call upon Ambassador Suklaw to make his remarks and concluding remarks. But just to say that the webinar will be uploaded on our website within 24 hours. So we're pretty quick in turning that around. But one of the questions, Anil, I wonder if you could also add to the ones that you are having to answer, is will Africa be the grass that the elephants will be trampling over? That's US and China as they try and have this contestation between them. Thank you. Over to you, Anil.
Thank you, Chair. Let me firstly start with the issue of the vaccine. At the summit, the extraordinary summit that China-Africa held on 17 June 2020 to look at solidarity against COVID-19. At that summit, China pledged to support Africa and setting aside a certain number of Sinopharm vaccines for the continent. On the issue of debt relief, at that summit, China pledged to cancel the debt of relevant African countries in the form of interest-free government loans. For those African countries that have been severely affected by the pandemic and are under heavy financial stress, China pledged to work with the global community to give them greater support as well as to extend the period of debt suspension. The Chinese government also pledged to encourage Chinese financial institutions to respond to the G20's debt service suspension initiative. So you can see that at that summit, there was very clear outcomes in terms of addressing Africa's debt needs as a result of the pandemic. The other question that was raised is that, is there vaccine cooperation within Brics? Yes, we had the first Brics Sherpa meeting last month under India's chairship, and this is one of the areas we have discussed. It is part of the agenda to see how we can cooperate within Brics in terms of addressing the issue of vaccines. And also, as you know, in 2018, during South Africa's chairship, there was a summit-level decision to establish a Brics Vaccine Research and Development Center. That process is going fairly well. Last year, China put forward a paper supporting the initiative on how we can actualize this Vaccine Research Development Center. India is taking that forward. We are currently locked in discussion with our colleagues from DSTI, DTI, and Department of Health and DIRCO to address the outstanding issues on South Africa's side, because we believe this will also be an important avenue in terms of vaccine cooperation within BRICS. With regard to the issue of the Quad, now I did say this is going to be an era where we may not make complete sense of some of the configurations that are emerging and membership there too. There's going to be a gray area. I was speaking a few days ago about the concept of South-South cooperation as we traditionally understand it. South-South cooperation, as we understood it when it firstly evolved in the modern era during the Asia-Africa Summit in Bandung, and what South-South cooperation today is vastly different. There's blurred lines between South-South and North-South cooperation. And I think you know what I'm referring to there, and we need to give that more attention. Now let's look at the Quad. India is part of the Quad together with Australia, Japan, and the USA. India is also part of BRICS, the Russia, India, China configuration. And they had the first summit meeting on the margins of the G20 in Argentina. And this year, Russia is planning a BRICS summit on the margins of the G20 in Italy at the end of October this year. India is part of BRICS, so is China. India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so is China. India is being invited to the D10 this year as part of the extended G7. That's another configuration. At the same time, I spoke of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. China is the largest shareholder there, holding 26.5%. The second largest shareholder in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is India, holding 7.6%, and the third largest shareholder is Russia. So between Russia, India, and China, they hold 40% of shareholdings in the AAIB. Another 10% is held by UK, France, and Germany. So therefore, I am saying you're going to find these kind of multiple memberships of various emerging structures. We must not forget also in this equation the emergence of the Indo-Pacific dynamic and how this is playing out, which also involves Africa. But we're not giving this any serious attention, and yet it has serious implications for us. It's something that we need to address. Africa will not be the grass under the elephant's foot. I say this very confidently, because the Africa of 2000, when we were described as the lost continent in The Economist, has risen tremendously. We have moved. Yes, Africa is still relatively poor, but Africa is much better organized, much more confident, and we are shaping the narrative in terms of our partnerships. Previously, partnerships were shaped for us. Today, we are shaping jointly those agendas, all of the partnerships we have. Yes, we do have weaknesses, but Africa is a lucrative market. It's the last frontier of development. All of the other frontiers are saturated, and Africa has a growing middle class, so has Asia. Those are the only two regions in the world that are frontiers of opportunity. It's in Asia and Africa. The UN predicts that by 2100, 89% of the global population will be between Africa and China. Africa and China will account for 89% of the global population. And that's where your markets are. Yes, there are weaknesses in terms of our economies. We are addressing that, and we need these partners. But we need to ensure that the kind of partnership we craft, including with China, must be a partnership for win-win cooperation and for mutual benefit. And we need to be the architects of this, whether through bilateral agreements, through regional agreements, or through the African Union. And I think that's where we can continue to grow and strengthen Africa. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, Agenda 2063, the NEPAD, are important programs and building blocks to ensure that we safeguard the interests of Africa, but we need these global partnerships. as we march towards progressing Africa in terms of our development and addressing some of the challenges that we face on the continent. I'm confident that will not be the grass that will be smashed under the elephant's feet. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much to all the participants. I know there's a number of questions that are still coming in, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I always believe that keep people panting for more at the end of any seminar. This just shows that we do need a lot more of these kind of engagements. I think there's a number of questions. Sanusha, thank you for your question focusing on the issues of financing, overseas development. There's a number of questions that are on the technology issues, etc. But hopefully we can host another session with the Embassy of China and DIRCO in taking some of the discussions forward. So in conclusion, I want to thank all the colleagues that have made this possible. Great Sun from the Chinese Embassy, Vic Hu from the Chinese Embassy, and then Jaimal from DIRCO, thank you very much. And then from MISTRA, Sipukazi, Noma, Zenzo, and Jabulo, Susan, thank you all very much. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Professor and Dr. Anil Suklao. Thank you, Ambassador Shen. Thank you, Dr. Philani Mthembu. And most importantly, thank you for all of you to come in and stay, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Looking forward to future sessions. You may be able to book to buy the book through our website if you wish to buy the book that Philani contributed the chapter in. So please get in touch with our website. You can look at the webinar tomorrow within the next 24 hours. And if you wish to order any of our books, please do so through the website. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye.